helpless, pain, humiliation. Don't do it, please. The girl's voice cracked across the dry summer grass. She hung upside down from a low tree branch, one ankle twisted tight in a steel trap that had been chained to the trunk. Her hair dragged through the dirt, her hands clawed weakly at the ground, trying to push herself up, but every movement only drove the iron teeth deeper into her ankle. Blood had already soaked through the torn fabric around her leg. And now, a man was walking toward her. Slow, heavy steps through the grass. He didn't hurry. He didn't speak. The girl saw him coming, and her chest began to shake with quiet sobs, because he didn't look like a rescuer. He looked like the kind of man a frightened girl prayed she would never meet, alone in the mountains. Tall, broad shoulders, a coat covered in trail dust, a beard streaked with gray, and eyes that didn't rush, eyes that studied everything before deciding anything. The girl tried to twist away from him. Pain shot through her leg. She cried out and grabbed the dirt. The man stopped a few steps away and looked down at the trap clamped around her ankle. Then he slowly crouched. His hand moved toward the metal jaws. The girl shook her head wildly. No, please. Tears ran into the dust on her face. Don't cut it, please. She had heard the stories. Sometimes the only way out of a trap was to cut the foot free. And sometimes the men who found trapped girls weren't trying to save them at all. The man said nothing. He simply placed both hands on the iron trap. The girl squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the blade, waiting for the scream. Instead, she heard something else, a deep grunt. Metal creaked. She opened her eyes just in time to see the man's arms tighten like thick ropes under his sleeves. He wasn't reaching for a knife. He wedged the trap chain against the tree, planted both hands on the iron, and tried to break it. The rusted spring resisted. The iron groaned. For a moment, nothing moved. Then the man leaned harder, his jaw tightening as he forced the steel apart with brutal strength. The trap snapped open with a sharp crack. The girl's leg dropped free. She gasped in disbelief. The man immediately tore a strip from the sleeve of his own shirt. He wrapped it around her ankle carefully, pressing just enough to slow the bleeding. His hands were rough, scarred, and steady, like a man who had done this many times before. Move your toes, he said quietly. The girl blinked in confusion. Then she tried. Her toes twitched. Barely. But they moved. The man gave a small nod. Good. He tied the cloth tighter and sat back on his heels. For the first time, the girl really looked at him. Up close, he looked even more dangerous. There were old scars across his knuckles, a long pale mark along his jaw, and something tired behind his eyes. The kind of tired that came from years on rough trails and harder nights. He turned his head suddenly. His horse had lifted its head. The animal snorted once and stamped a hoof. The man listened, quiet, still, because horses rarely lied in the mountains. Someone was out there, watching. The man stood slowly and scanned the tall grass rolling across the hillside. Nothing moved, no rider, no shadow. But the grass in one patch looked pressed down, as if someone had been lying there not long ago. The man walked back to the tree and studied the rope tied to the branch, then the broken grass around the trap. His voice came low. This wasn't meant for deer. The girl felt cold all over. You mean... He nodded once. A man? Yeah, said this. Not just any man. This was a recapture trap. The kind used to catch a runaway alive, hurt, and too frightened to try again. The rope had done the rest, jerking her upside down when the trap snapped shut. The girl swallowed hard. Her name was Cassidy. She was 21 years old, and a few hours earlier, she'd been running for her life through these same hills. She tried to sit up again. Pain flashed through her ankle, and she nearly collapsed. The mountain man caught her before she fell. His grip was strong but careful, like he knew exactly how much pressure a wounded body could take. Cassidy stared at him, still unsure and still afraid. Why did you help me? She whispered. The man didn't answer. He kept watching the hills, listening. Then he crouched beside her again. You able to stand if I lift you? I think so. He slipped one arm under her shoulders and helped her slowly upright. Cassidy bit her lip as pain burned through her leg, but she stayed standing, barely. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind moved through the tall summer grass. Far away, a hawk cried over the valley. Then Cassidy noticed something that made her stomach tighten. On the inside of the man's wrist was a faded scar, a mark burned deep into the skin. She had seen that mark before. Her breath stopped, because one of the men who chased her carried the exact same mark on his arm. The girl took a slow step back. Fear crept into her voice again. You. The mountain man finally looked down at her. Quiet. Patient. But Cassidy could not stop staring at that scar. The same mark. The same one the men hunting her carried. And now Cassidy had a brand new reason to be afraid. The man who had saved her might also be tied to the men hunting her. And in the Bitterroot Hills, that kind of mistake could get a person killed fast. If the mountain man truly hated the men hunting Cassidy, why did he carry the same burn mark they did? And why were armed riders already closing in on the two of them in the tall grass? Cassidy could not stop staring at the scar on the mountain man's wrist. The mark looked old, burned deep into the skin long ago. The same mark she had seen on the arm of one of the men who captured her. Her throat tightened. She took another slow step back. You know them, she whispered. The man noticed where she was looking. His eyes dropped to the faded mark. For a moment he said nothing. Then he quietly pulled his sleeve down to cover it. They don't own that mark, he said. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of someone who had argued about that mark before. Cassidy didn't move closer. Her ankle throbbed. Her leg trembled, but fear kept her standing. You had it first, she asked. The mountain man shook his head once. No. That answer didn't help. The wind pushed through the tall grass again. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped. Both of them heard it. The man's head turned toward the sound. His eyes narrowed. Then he looked back at Cassidy. Can you walk? He asked. A little. We need more than a little. Cassidy swallowed. Her voice came out small. Are they close? The mountain man didn't lie. Closer than I'd like. He walked to his horse and pulled down a small canvas bag. Inside were a few bandages, a tin cup, and a small bottle of whiskey. He poured a little over the cloth wrapped around Cassidy's ankle. She flinched. Sorry, he said. That helps. It keeps the wound honest. Cassidy had no idea what that meant, but she nodded anyway. The man tightened the bandage again. Then he stepped back and studied the clearing one more time. The trap, the rope, the crushed grass, every piece of it told the same story. Someone had set a human trap. Someone had waited. And someone had just barely missed their catch. And he walked back to Cassidy. What's your name? He asked. Cassidy. You got family with you. Cassidy. Her eyes dropped to the ground. I did. The man didn't ask more right away. People out here learned when to leave silence alone. But after a moment, Cassidy spoke again. We were traveling north, she said, from Idaho. My father had business in Missoula. She paused, then forced the rest out. They came at night. The mountain man didn't interrupt. At first, we thought they were traders, she continued. They rode into camp like they belonged there. Her hands trembled slightly as she remembered. Then someone started shooting. The man beside her stayed very still. Men who fought back were killed, she said quietly. They dragged the rest of us out of the wagons. Her voice cracked. They tied our hands and made us ride. The mountain man's jaw tightened. He had heard stories like this before. Too many times. But Cassidy kept talking. I ran this morning. She looked toward the hills. I didn't even know where I was going. Her breathing grew uneven. I just knew if I stopped running, they'd catch me again. The man nodded slowly. And this trap finished the job, he said. Cassidy looked at the broken steel in the dirt. I thought I was dead when I saw you. He gave a quiet half shrug, still deciding if that's true. For the first time since they met, Cassidy almost laughed. Just a small sound, but it broke the tight air between them. The mountain man reached down and picked up the trap. He studied it carefully. Then he turned it over and showed Cassidy something carved into the metal frame. 2 small letters, S and R. Cassidy's face went pale. I saw that before, she whispered. On a wagon crate. The man's eyes hardened. Thought so. You know what it means, she asked. He nodded once. Silas Ridge. What you are hearing comes from old frontier accounts and regional stories. carefully retold for clarity, emotion, and historical atmosphere. A few small details have been shaped for storytelling. The images in this video are AI assisted to help bring the feeling of that lost world a little closer. Cassidy felt her stomach drop. "That's him," she said quickly. "That's the man they listened to." The mountain man looked out across the hills again. The name meant something to him. Something old. Something unpleasant. After a moment, he sighed. "Well," he said quietly, "that explains the trap." Cassidy hesitated. "You know him." The man took a long breath. "Used to." He lifted the trap chain and tossed it aside. "Didn't expect to see his work this far out again." Cassidy suddenly understood something. "You weren't surprised when I said men set this trap?" The mountain man looked back at her. "No." The wind shifted again. This time his horse snorted louder. The animal's ears snapped forward. That was all the warning the mountain man needed. He stepped closer to Cassidy. "Listen to me," he said. His voice dropped lower now. "You're going to lean on me, and we're going to move toward those rocks." He pointed to a low ridge about 50 yards away. Cassidy nodded quickly. "What about them?" she asked. "They'll come check the trap, and when they see it's empty," he gave a thin smile, "then they'll start running." Cassidy swallowed. "And us, we start now." He helped her take the first step. Her ankle screamed in pain, but she forced herself forward. Step by step, they moved through the tall grass, slow, careful. Behind them, the empty trap lay open in the dirt. Somewhere beyond the hill, a rider shouted. Then another voice answered. The mountain man's eyes hardened. "They found it," he muttered. Cassidy's heart started pounding. They reached the rocks just as two distant gunshots echoed across the valley. Not aimed, just signals. More riders were coming. The mountain man glanced toward the trail that led deeper into the Bitterroot foothills. Then he looked back at Cassidy. "You picked a bad morning to run," he said. She tried to smile through the fear. "Still better than staying." He nodded once. "Fair point." They kept moving along the rocks, slow but steady. Because both of them knew the same thing now. The broken trap had already been found. The riders were coming, and Cassidy still did not know whether the man beside her was truly her way out, or just the last stop before the end. The first rider appeared sooner than Cassidy hoped. They had barely reached the low rocks when a horse crested the hill behind them. The mountain man heard it before he saw it. Hoofbeats, fast, not wandering, hunting. He pulled Cassidy down behind the rocks and pressed a finger to his lips. She froze. Her ankle throbbed so badly she could feel her heartbeat inside it. The rider stopped near the broken trap. Even from a distance, they could hear the man shouting. Another rider answered from somewhere farther down the slope. Cassidy's chest tightened. "There were 6, she whispered. The mountain man glanced at her. 6. She nodded. "At the camp." He looked back toward the hill. "Then we're already doing better than I thought." Cassidy wasn't sure if that was meant to comfort her. The mountain man slowly unslung the rifle from his shoulder. It was an old Winchester, worn smooth by years of use. He checked the chamber out of habit. Loaded. Always loaded. Cassidy watched his hands. They moved calmly, not fast, not nervous, like a man fixing a fence post instead of preparing for trouble. "You shoot?" he asked quietly. She blinked. "A little." He raised one eyebrow. "That's usually how trouble starts." Despite everything, she almost smiled again. The mountain man leaned just enough to see over the rock. The first rider had dismounted. The man stood beside the trap, staring down at the broken metal. Even from 50 yards away, the anger in his body was obvious. He kicked the trap hard. Then he pointed toward the hills and shouted again. 2 more riders appeared. Cassidy's stomach dropped. "They found the rope," she whispered. The mountain man nodded. "They know you ran." One of the riders bent down and touched the blood on the grass. Then he pointed straight toward the rocks. Cassidy felt the world tilt. "They know where we are." "Not yet," the mountain man said. "But they're thinking about it." He scanned the slope quickly. The riders were spreading out now. One moved left. One stayed near the trap. Another started riding slowly toward the rocks. Cassidy's breath quickened. "What do we do?" the mountain man thought for a moment. Then he looked at her ankle. "You still able to limp?" "I think so." "Good." He pointed toward a narrow stretch of trees farther down the ridge. "We make it to those pines." "Then what?" Then we see who runs out of breath first. Cassidy looked at the distance. It felt like a mile. It was probably 100 yards. Still, with her ankle, it might as well have been 10 miles. The mountain man must have seen the doubt on her face. He leaned the rifle against the rock and crouched beside her. Listen, he said quietly. You don't have to outrun them. Cassidy looked confused. What do I have to do? Just keep moving. He stood and lifted the rifle again. Then he fired. The shot cracked across the valley like a lightning strike. The rider near the trap dove behind his horse. The other two spun their mounts in surprise. The mountain man chambered another round calmly. Then he fired again. This shot kicked dust just in front of the rider moving toward the rocks. The man jerked his horse sideways and pulled back. Cassidy stared at him. You didn't hit him. Didn't need to. The mountain man grabbed her arm gently. Now we move. They slipped away from the rocks while the riders scrambled for cover. Cassidy limped beside him, leaning on his shoulder. Every step burned through her leg, but fear kept her going. Behind them, the riders shouted again. One of them fired blindly toward the rocks they had just left. The bullet hit stone and whined off into the hills. The mountain man didn't look back. He guided Cassidy steadily toward the trees, step by step, breath by breath. They reached the first line of pines just as another shot echoed across the valley. This one came closer. Too close. A branch above Cassidy snapped in half. She flinched and ducked. They're getting braver, she gasped. The mountain man nodded. That happens when men get angry. They moved deeper into the trees. The ground here was uneven and covered with needles. Cassidy nearly fell twice. Each time the mountain man caught her before she hit the ground. After a few minutes, the shouting behind them faded. The riders had lost sight of them in the trees, but that didn't mean the danger was over. The mountain man finally stopped beside a fallen log. He listened carefully. Nothing. Just whined through the pine branches. Cassidy leaned against the log and closed her eyes. Her whole body trembled now. From pain, from exhaustion, from everything that had happened since sunrise. The mountain man took a small canteen from his saddlebag and handed it to her. She drank slowly. The water tasted like metal and dust, but it helped. After a moment, she looked at him again. You could have left me, she said quietly. The mountain man shrugged. Maybe. But you didn't. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied the forest around them. Then he spoke. Men like Silas Ridge don't stop chasing things they think belong to them. Cassidy felt a chill. You think they'll keep coming? The mountain man looked back toward the ridge they had crossed. They'll bring more riders. Cassidy's voice dropped. How many? The mountain man gave a tired half smile. Enough. He looked at her injured ankle again. Then toward the mountains rising deeper into the Bitterroot wilderness. Finally he spoke. We've got one chance. Cassidy waited. What chance? The mountain man's eyes hardened slightly. We don't run away from Silas Ridge. He lifted the rifle and checked the trail behind them one more time. We run straight toward him. Cassidy's heart skipped. You mean his camp? The mountain man nodded once. And far away, somewhere beyond the trees, another gunshot echoed through the valley, which meant one thing. More riders had just joined the hunt. The wind moved slowly through the pine trees. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. Cassidy sat against the fallen log, trying to steady her breathing while the pain in her ankle pulsed in quiet waves. The mountain man stood nearby, watching the forest the way a man watches water before crossing a river. Careful, patient, waiting for the wrong ripple. Somewhere far behind them, a rider shouted again. The sound echoed faintly through the trees. Cassidy opened her eyes. They're still looking. The mountain man nodded once. They will be all day. He crouched and drew a rough line in the dirt with a small stick. A simple map, a ridge, a creek, a narrow valley. Cassidy leaned forward, trying to follow. You said we run toward him, she said. Toward Silas Ridge. The man tapped the stick against the dirt valley. His supply trail runs through here, Cassidy frowned. You know his camp. I know where a man like him would hide one. She studied the drawing. And you're sure? The mountain man gave a tired smile. No. He wiped the map away with his boot. But I know the kind of ground he likes. Cassidy tried to stand. Her ankle nearly gave out again. The mountain man caught her arm before she fell. Easy. I can walk, she insisted. You can limp. That's still walking. He let out a quiet breath that might have been a laugh. Fair enough. They moved again. Slow steps through the pine shadows. The ground sloped downward toward a shallow creek that cut through the valley floor. Water trickled over stones, cold, clear. Cassidy crouched and splashed some on her face. For a moment, the world felt almost peaceful. Birds moved through the trees. Wind stirred the branches, but the mountain man didn't relax. He scanned the hills constantly, every ridge, every shadow, every place a rider could appear. Cassidy noticed. You've done this before, he glanced at her. What? Running from men like that? He shrugged slightly. Sometimes. She studied him for a moment. You were a lawman once. It was not really a question. The mountain man paused, then he nodded slowly. Deputy? Cassidy looked surprised. You don't look like one now. That was a long time ago. What happened? He stepped over a fallen branch and kept walking. World happened. Cassidy sensed the wall in his voice. She didn't push further. After a while, they reached the creek. The mountain man stopped and studied the ground carefully. Tracks, old wagon ruts, hoof prints. Some fresh, some days old. He crouched beside a deep print and touched the edge of the dirt. Still soft. 2 horses, he murmured. Cassidy leaned closer. You can tell that. He nodded. Heavy ones. He stood and looked downstream. They passed through not long ago. Silas's men, maybe. Cassidy felt a cold knot in her stomach. What if they're heading back to the camp? The mountain man gave a small nod. That's what I'm hoping. She blinked. You want them to find us? No. He looked at the winding creek disappearing between the trees. I want them to lead us. Cassidy didn't like the sound of that, but she also understood something now. The mountain man was not just running. He was hunting. They crossed the creek slowly. The cold water soaked through Cassidy's boot and sent a sharp sting through her ankle. She clenched her teeth but kept moving. On the far side, the trees thinned slightly. The land opened into a narrow valley with tall grass and scattered boulders. The mountain man stopped suddenly. His eyes narrowed. Cassidy followed his gaze. At first, she saw nothing. Then she noticed it. A thin thread of gray smoke rising far ahead between 2 hills. Her breath caught. A fire. The mountain man nodded slowly. Cooking fire. That could be anyone. Not this far off the wagon road. Cassidy's voice dropped. You think it's them? The mountain man didn't answer right away. He studied the smoke for a long moment. Then he spoke quietly. There's another reason I think it is. Cassidy waited. What? He pointed toward a line of wooden posts half hidden in the grass. They ran along the edge of the valley like broken fence markers. Cassidy squinted. What are those? The mountain man's face hardened slightly. Old survey stakes. For what? He looked back toward the distant smoke. Mining claims. Cassidy felt the pieces begin to fit together. You think Silas is running a camp out here? The mountain man nodded. Men like him don't just steal people. They put them to work. Cassidy's stomach twisted. So the girls they took. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The wind shifted slightly. The faint smell of wood smoke drifted toward them. Real. Close. The mountain man slowly unslung the rifle from his shoulder again. His voice lowered. If that's his camp, Cassidy finished the thought quietly, then the other girls might still be there. He looked at her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the mountain man gave a slow nod. That's what I'm afraid of. Cassidy looked back toward the rising smoke. Fear and determination tangled together in her chest. Because if those girls were still alive, and if Silas Ridge was really hiding in that valley, then the man who had broken the trap with his bare hands was about to walk straight into the place he had spent years avoiding, and the smoke rising above those hills meant something else too. They were no longer the hunters. Someone inside that camp had already seen them coming. The thin column of smoke rose slowly above the valley. Cassidy kept staring at it. Part of her wanted to turn around and run the other way, but another part of her could not stop thinking about the girls who had been taken with her. Girls who had cried through the night. Girls who had whispered about escape but never found the courage to try. And now that smoke meant something terrible. It meant they might still be there. Working. waiting. Or worse, the mountain man lowered himself behind a cluster of rocks and studied the valley floor. The camp was still too far to see clearly, but signs were beginning to appear. A wagon track. Fresh horse prints. Broken grass where something heavy had been dragged. He watched quietly for several minutes. Then he spoke. 2 guards, Cassidy blinked. Where? He pointed toward a slope covered in brush. Cassidy followed his finger. At first she saw nothing. Then she noticed a flicker of movement, a man shifting his weight beside a tree. Another sitting near a stump with a rifle across his knees. Her stomach tightened. They're watching the trail. The mountain man nodded. That's the idea, Cassidy whispered. How many do you think are down there? The mountain man didn't answer right away. He watched the smoke again, then the wagons, then the tree line. More than we want, he finally said. Cassidy wrapped her arms around herself. We should go to Missoula, she said quietly. Find the law. The mountain man gave a tired breath through his nose. The law is 2 days away. And those girls might not have 2 days. Cassidy lowered her head. She knew he was right. For a moment they both stayed silent. Then the mountain man shifted his rifle and looked at her again. You said they took girls from your wagon train. She nodded. 3 others. You see them after they captured you. Cassidy hesitated. Yes. Where? In a wagon cage. Her voice tightened as she remembered. They kept us tied together. The mountain man's eyes hardened. You remember where they moved you after that? Cassidy pointed toward the valley. There. The word barely came out. The mountain man looked back at the smoke again, his voice lowered. Then, they're probably still alive. Cassidy felt hope and fear twist together inside her chest. Probably. He met her eyes. Men like Silas don't waste labor. The sentence landed hard. Cassidy understood exactly what he meant. The mountain man studied the guards again. One of them stood and stretched, the other walked toward the fire, both relaxed, both careless, because neither of them expected trouble from the hills. Finally, the mountain man nodded once. We're going down. Cassidy's head snapped up. Down, slow. He pointed toward a shallow dip in the valley. Tall grass and scattered stones, just enough cover for 2 people willing to crawl. Cassidy looked at her ankle, then at the distance. That's a long crawl. Good thing we started early. Despite everything, she almost smiled again. The mountain man removed a small knife from his belt. He cut a strip from his coat sleeve and handed it to her. Tie that around your boot. Why? To keep the leather quiet, Cassidy did as he said. The cloth wrapped tightly around the heel of her boot. The mountain man checked the rifle one more time. Then he looked at her. Stay behind me. Cassidy nodded. They began moving downhill slowly. Not walking, not standing, sliding through the grass, one careful step at a time. The guards never looked up. Wind moved through the valley. The smoke drifted sideways. The smell of cooking meat floated faintly through the air. After 20 yards, Cassidy's ankle burned like fire. After 40 yards, sweat rolled down her back. But they kept moving, closer, closer. Soon the camp began to appear between the rocks. 2 wagons, a crude wooden shack, a rough corral with 3 horses tied to the rail, and near the shack, a heavy wagon with iron bars on the sides. Cassidy stopped breathing. The cage, she whispered. The mountain man glanced at her. You sure? She nodded slowly. I remember the wheels. They waited, watching. No movement inside the wagon. But that didn't mean it was empty. The mountain man studied the guard positions again. Then he whispered, when the wind shifts, we move faster. Cassidy nodded. Seconds passed. Then the breeze changed direction. The smoke blew straight across the valley, straight toward the guards. For a moment their view uphill disappeared. The mountain man moved fast. He grabbed Cassidy's arm and guided her toward a low boulder only 20 yards from the camp. They reached it just as the smoke cleared again. The guards still had not noticed them. Cassidy leaned against the rock, breathing hard. The mountain man looked around the edge of the stone. Now the camp was clear. He could see the shack door, the wagons, the fire, and something else. His eyes narrowed. 2 more men had just walked out of the shack. One carried a shovel. The other held a whip. Cassidy followed his gaze. Her face turned pale. Those are the men, she whispered. The ones who took us. The mountain man's jaw tightened. He watched them for several seconds, then he spoke quietly. That means the rest of them are nearby, Cassidy swallowed. How many is the rest? The mountain man leaned the rifle slowly against the rock and looked back toward the shack. I'd guess 4 inside. Cassidy felt the ground drop under her. That's 6. The mountain man nodded once. At least. She stared at him. And there's only 2 of us. He gave a calm shrug. That depends how you count. Cassidy blinked. What does that mean? The mountain man looked back toward the iron cage wagon. Then he said something that made Cassidy's heart pound even harder. If those girls are still alive in that wagon, he lifted the rifle again, then there might be a lot more than 2 of us about to start a fight. Cassidy kept her eyes on the iron cage wagon. For a second, she forgot the pain in her ankle, forgot the guards, forgot the rifle in the mountain man's hands. All she could think about was the sound those girls had made in the dark the night before. Soft crying, chains shifting, one girl whispering for her mother until somebody outside the wagon told her to shut up. The mountain man watched the camp in silence. He had the stillness of a man who knew that one wrong move could turn a rescue into a burial. The smoke drifted low across the fire. One guard bent over a pan. Another walked toward the corral. The 2 men near the shack were arguing about something Cassidy could not hear. That helped. Men who talked too much stopped listening. The mountain man leaned close to Cassidy. Can you stay here alone for 1 minute? He asked. Cassidy looked at the camp again, then at him. What are you going to do? Get closer. That's not an answer. It's the one I got. She didn't like it, but she understood. He pointed toward a patch of brush near the back of the shack. If I wave, you come down to that brush. Cassidy nodded. And if you don't wave, his eyes stayed on the camp, then you stay put. He moved before she could say anything else. Low, quiet, just a shape sliding through grass and smoke. Cassidy watched him disappear behind a stack of split timber near the shack. Her mouth went dry. She could barely breathe. One of the guards laughed at something. Another spat into the dirt. None of them noticed the mountain man. Not yet. Cassidy looked back at the iron wagon. At first it seemed empty. Then she saw it. Movement behind the bars. A face. Thin, pale. A young woman looking out through the shadows. Cassidy felt her heart jump. The girl saw her, too. For one dangerous second, they stared at each other. Cassidy lifted a finger to her lips. The girl gave the smallest nod. Alive. At least one of them was still alive. Then the shack door opened. A bigger man stepped out into the light. Broad hat, clean coat, boots too polished for a labor camp. He was not hauling wood or stirring beans. He was the kind who gave orders and expected men to obey them fast. Cassidy felt all the warmth leave her body. Even from this distance, she knew him. Silas Ridge. He had smiled the night her wagon train was attacked. Not a wild smile. Not the grin of a drunk fool. A polite smile. That had been the worst part. He looked like a man who might ask about the weather while other men tied your hands. Silas stopped near the fire and spoke to the guard by the pan. Then he turned his head slightly. His eyes drifted once toward the brush line. A patch of grass had moved there, then gone still too fast. Cassidy could not hear the words, but she saw the guard point toward the hills, toward the broken trail they had used. Silas didn't panic. He didn't shout. He simply stood there thinking. That frightened Cassidy more than anger would have. Because angry men made mistakes. Quiet men made plans. She searched for the mountain man again. For a moment she could not find him. Then she saw the edge of his shoulder behind the timber stack. Still there. Still waiting. One of the men with the shovel walked away from the shack and headed toward the cage wagon. He reached into his pocket for a key. Cassidy's heart had started pounding harder. If he opened that wagon now, the girls might be moved. If they were moved, everything would get worse. Then the mountain man made his move. He stepped from behind the timber stack and came up behind the man so quickly it hardly looked real. One hand covered the man's mouth. The other drove the knife handle hard into the side of his neck. The man sagged without a sound. The mountain man dragged him behind the timber before anyone noticed. Cassidy let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. A second later, she saw it. A short wave of the hand from the brush line, her signal. She started moving, fast as her ankle would allow. The pain almost folded her in half, but fear kept her upright. She slipped through the grass, reached the brush, dropped beside the mountain man. The guard he had taken down lay still in the dirt, breathing but out cold. The mountain man held up the key. Cassidy stared at it. "The wagon," she whispered. He nodded once. Then he looked at the camp again. "Problem is, once that door opens, quiet ends." Cassidy swallowed. "How many girls? I guessing won't help." He studied the men at the fire. Ithias was now walking toward the far side of the shack. 2 guards remained in clear view, one near the corral, one by the flames. Another shadow moved behind the shack window. At least one more inside. Cassidy looked at the key in his hand, then at the wagon. "We can't leave them." The mountain man gave her a sideways look. "Didn't say we would." He reached into his pocket and took out 3 loose rifle cartridges. Then he placed them in her palm. Cassidy frowned. "I don't have a rifle. Not for shooting." He pointed toward the campfire. The understanding came slowly. Then all at once, her eyes widened. "You want a distraction?" He gave a small nod. "Need the men looking the wrong way for 10 seconds. Cassidy looked at the cartridges, then at the fire, then back at the wagon. 10 seconds. That was all. No more. The mountain man leaned in a little closer. His voice dropped low. "When I move, you crawl to that fire pit and toss those rounds into the flames." Cassidy stared at him. "That could kill somebody." He shook his head. "Not if they're lucky." That was not very comforting. But then again, neither was the camp. Cassidy closed her fingers around the cartridges. The metal felt warm already from her hand. The mountain man checked the rifle, then looked straight at her. No smile now, no half joke, just steady eyes. "You wanted to know if you're still running," he said quietly. Cassidy nodded. He looked toward the cage wagon. "You're not." Then he rose and slipped into the smoke again. And just as Cassidy drew her first shaky breath to move, the shack door swung open wide and a man's voice called out one name that made the mountain man stop in his tracks. "Boone." The name hit the air like a gunshot. Boone froze. For half a second, everything in the valley stopped. The smoke drifted over the fire. The guards shifted their weight. A horse stomped near the corral, and Silas Ridge stepped fully out of the shack doorway. He looked older than Cassidy expected. Not weaker, just older. Gray had begun creeping into his beard, but his eyes were sharp and calm, like a man who had spent years learning how to wait. Silas rested one hand on the door frame and looked straight across the camp. Not guessing. Not searching. Looking directly at Boone. "I thought that was you," Silas said. His voice carried easily through the clearing, warm, almost friendly. Like he had just run into an old neighbor on the road. Boone didn't move. He stood beside the timber stack, half in shadow, rifle hanging loosely in one hand. For a moment, neither man spoke again. The guards glanced between them, confused. They didn't yet understand what was happening. Cassidy stayed low in the brush. Her hand still gripped the 3 cartridges. Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain someone would hear it. Silas stepped down from the shack porch. Slow, easy, like a man taking a walk after supper. "You've been gone a long time, Boone," he said. Boone finally answered, "Not long enough." One of the guards looked between them. "You know this man." "Boss," Silas smiled faintly. "Oh, we go back," Silas said. "Back before the mountains took you in. Back when Boone still believed some men could be trusted." His eyes never left Boone. Way back. Boone took a single step forward. Not aggressive, just enough to clear the shadow. The rifle stayed pointed at the dirt, but everyone in the clearing could see it now. Silas tilted his head slightly. "You always did like making an entrance?" Boone shrugged. "You always did like stealing other people's work?" Silas chuckled. The sound was quiet but real. "You still holding on to that old story?" Boone's eyes hardened. Behind him, Cassidy could feel the tension rising in the air like a storm building over dry ground. Silas looked toward the iron wagon, then back to Boone. "You hear about the girls?" Boone didn't answer. Silas sighed softly. "You always were a man with a soft heart for trouble." One of the guards shifted nervously. He clearly had no idea why his boss was chatting with an armed stranger. Silas noticed. He raised a hand slightly without looking away from Boone. "Relax." The guard stopped moving. Silas took a few more slow steps across the dirt until he stood near the fire. Smoke curled around him. "You know," Silas said calmly. "I figured you'd turn up someday." Boone's voice stayed flat. "You figured wrong." Silas smiled again. "Did I?" He gestured casually toward the hills behind Boone. "My men found your little trap mess this morning." Cassidy's stomach dropped. "So they already knew." Silas continued. "I told them there was only one man stubborn enough to break a steel trap barehanded." Boone didn't react. Silas spread his hands slightly. "And here you are." For a moment the wind shifted and blew the smoke between them. Cassidy watched through the gray haze. Silas's expression changed just a little. Not angry, just thoughtful. Then he spoke again. "You bring the girl back, Boone." His tone stayed calm. "Walk away." Boone's answer came fast. "No." The word landed hard in the quiet camp. One of the guards raised his rifle slightly. Silas lifted a finger. The guard froze again. Silas nodded slowly. "Still the same man." Boone tilted his head. "You hoping I changed?" Silas shrugged. "People usually do." His eyes flicked toward the wagon again. "You find something to care about." Boone followed his glance. The iron bars of the wagon glinted in the sun. Then Boone looked back at him. Silas leaned slightly closer to the fire. "Truth is," he said quietly, "I was surprised you lived this long." Boone's voice stayed steady. "Disappointed?" Silas smiled again. "Not at all." He took another slow step forward. "But I will be if this turns messy." The guards around the camp shifted uneasily. The tension had finally reached them. Silas glanced toward the brush line for the first time, not directly at Cassidy, but close enough to make her heart nearly stop. Then he looked back at Boone. "You know how this ends," Silas said calmly. Boone nodded once. "Yeah." Silas lifted one eyebrow. "And..." Boone slowly raised the Winchester rifle. Not rushed, not dramatic, just steady. "It ends with you losing something." The words hung in the air. Silas watched him carefully. Then he sighed. "You always did think you could fix things." Boone didn't answer. Behind the brush, Cassidy slowly opened her hand. The cartridges lay in her palm. 3 small pieces of brass, 10 seconds of chaos if she used them. Silas finally spoke again. "You know what's funny, Boone?" Boone said nothing. Silas's smile returned. "You spent 10 years hiding in those mountains." His voice dropped slightly. "And somehow you still walked straight back into my camp." Boone's eyes didn't blink. Silas tilted his head. "That almost makes me think you came here on purpose." Boone gave a quiet nod. "I did." For the first time, the smile on Silas's face faded just a little. Boone's voice stayed calm. "You took the wrong wagon train?" Silas studied him for a long moment. Then he chuckled softly again. "And you brought the wrong girl with you?" Cassidy felt the words hit her like ice, because the way Silas said it made one thing suddenly clear. He already knew she was there, and the moment he lifted his hand toward the brush, Cassidy realized the 10 seconds Boone needed were about to disappear forever. Silas lifted his hand slowly toward the brush, not pointing exactly at Cassidy, just close enough. That was worse, because it meant he didn't need to see her. He already knew. Cassidy felt the air leave her lungs. For a moment, her fingers tightened around the 3 cartridges in her hand. 10 seconds. That was all Boone needed. But now everything had changed. Silas spoke calmly. "Come out, girl." His voice was not angry. That made it worse. Men who shouted could be fooled. Men who spoke softly usually already had the answer. The guards turned toward the brush line. Rifles lifted, boots shifted in the dirt. Boone didn't look back. His rifle stayed steady on Silas, but his voice came out low. "Cassidy." Just her name. Nothing else. He didn't turn his head. "I did not give her away." But she understood. The plan had just become the only chance left. Silas smiled faintly. "You named her." Boone said nothing. Silas nodded slightly as if confirming a small thought. "I figured as much." He glanced toward the brush again, then toward the cage wagon. "Funny thing about fear," Silas said quietly. "It makes people move when they shouldn't." Cassidy felt her heart pounding so hard she could barely hear anything else. 2 guards were already walking slowly toward the brush. 10 steps away, 8, 6. If they reached her now, everything would collapse. She looked down at the cartridges. 3 pieces of brass, small, simple, but loud. Once they hit the fire, Boone still stood in the open, not moving, holding the entire camp's attention. The guards moved closer. 5 steps, 4. Cassidy took one breath. Then she moved, low, fast. She crawled out of the brush toward the fire pit just as the guards turned their heads toward the movement. One of them started shouting. Too late. Cassidy threw the cartridges straight into the flames. For 1 second, nothing happened. The cartridges popped wild and hot. More noise than danger, but enough to turn every head in camp. Then the first round exploded. A sharp crack burst from the fire pit. The guard nearest the flames jumped back in surprise. The second cartridge went off half a second later. Another crack, another flash. Men shouted. One ducked behind a wagon. Another spun with his rifle pointed in the wrong direction. The camp erupted into confusion, and Boone moved. His rifle fired once. The shot slammed into the guard near the corral before the man even knew what was happening. Boone was already running, straight for the cage wagon. Cassidy rolled behind the fire pit as the third cartridge exploded. A guard fired blindly toward the brush. The bullet hit dirt several feet away. Silas stepped backward near the shack, not panicked, just clearing the center of the chaos. Boone reached the wagon in 3 long strides. The iron bars rattled as he grabbed the door. Cassidy saw the girls inside now, 3 of them, thin, dirty, eyes wide with shock. Boone shoved the key into the lock. For a terrifying second, it stuck. Then it turned. The cage door swung open. Out, Boone barked. The girls hesitated. Fear had trained them not to move without permission. Boone grabbed the nearest one and pulled her toward the ground. Now! That broke the spell. The others followed. A guard near the shack finally regained his balance and fired. The bullet smashed into the wagon wheel inches from Boone. Splinters flew. Cassidy scrambled toward the wagon as the freed girls stumbled out. Another shot rang out, this one from the trees, not from the camp. One of the guards dropped instantly. Boone's head snapped toward the sound. Riders were appearing along the ridge above the valley, and more guns, more men. Silas's reinforcements had arrived. The camp erupted into shouting. One of the new riders fired again. The bullet tore through the dirt beside Boone's boot. Cassidy reached the wagon just as the last girl jumped down. What now? She gasped. Boone grabbed her arm and pulled her behind the wagon. The freed girls crouched beside them, shaking but alive. Boone looked toward the ridge. At least 6 riders now, maybe more behind them. Silas stepped slowly out from the side of the shack. He brushed dust from his sleeve like a man annoyed by spilled coffee. Then he looked straight at Boone again. His voice carried easily over the chaos. You always were impatient. Boone didn't answer. His eyes scanned the valley quickly. 1 guard still near the fire, 2 by the corral, riders above. Silas in the open. Too many guns. Not enough cover. Cassidy could see the calculation in Boone's face. He leaned close to her. His voice dropped low again. We're not staying here. Cassidy nodded quickly. No argument. He pointed toward a narrow cut in the rocks behind the shack. A small ravine leading into the hills. If we reach that gap, we disappear. Cassidy looked at the riders. They'll chase us. Boone gave a short nod. That's the idea. One of the freed girls whispered beside them. Why? Boone chambered another round into the Winchester. His answer was quiet. Because if they chase us, he glanced toward Silas. The camp stays empty. Cassidy followed his eyes. Silas was watching them closely now. Not angry, not rushed, just waiting. As if he knew something Boone did not. And when Boone finally stood to lead the girls toward the ravine, Silas lifted one hand calmly and called out something that made Boone stop cold in the middle of the gunfire. Careful where you run, Boone. Silas smiled again. That ravine only has one way out. Boone stopped cold at the mouth of the ravine. Silas was smiling for a reason. The cut in the rocks narrowed hard about 30 yards in, then dead-ended under a shelf of broken stone. It was not an escape path. It was a funnel, a place to trap desperate people and shoot them easy. Cassidy saw it too. Her stomach dropped. You knew, she whispered. Boone did not answer right away. He looked once into the ravine, then back toward the camp, then up at the ridge, riders on one side, guns below, stone walls ahead. For one bad second, Silas had them. Then Boone's eyes shifted to the rock shelf above the narrow cut. Loose stone, old slide marks, just enough. Spring runoff had already chewed the base of it hollow. He handed the Winchester to Cassidy. "Hold this." She took it with both hands. "What are you doing? Buying us a road?" Before anyone could stop him, Boone climbed 2 strides up the left wall of the ravine, jammed his boot against a crack in the stone, and threw his shoulder into a loose slab that had been waiting years to fall. At first, nothing happened. Then the rock groaned, a second shove, a sharp crack. Then half the shelf came down at once. Stone and dirt thundered into the mouth of the ravine. Dust exploded outward. The nearest riders jerked their horses back. One man nearly lost his seat. Another shouted as rocks skipped across the trail. In 3 seconds, the narrow cut was choked shut. Not forever, but long enough. Boone dropped back to the ground, grabbed the rifle from Cassidy, and pointed uphill. "Now we move!" The girls ran. Not neatly, not bravely, just hard, which was enough. Cassidy caught one by the arm and pulled her forward. Another stumbled, and Boone shoved her on. Behind them, the riders were still fighting dust, frightened horses, and fallen rock. Silas did not shout. He just stood there, watching, his face gone cold. Half his riders were still fighting spooked horses and fallen rock. And that bought Boone the only thing he needed, because now he understood what Boone had done. He had not won the valley. He had only stolen time. And sometimes time is the only thing people need to stay alive. Only when the group reached the far bend of the pass did Boone slow down. The gunfire behind them faded little by little. Smoke drifted above the broken camp. And the mountains finally gave them one thing they had not had all day: distance. Cassidy leaned against the stone wall of the pass, breathing hard. Her ankles still hurt. Her hands still shook. But the fear that had lived inside her since the attack was no longer in charge of her. Not the way it had been that morning. One of the rescued girls quietly wiped tears from her face. Another stared at the open sky above the valley as if she had not seen freedom in years. Boone finally spoke. "We move before they change their minds." The girls nodded. Slowly, the small group disappeared deeper into the mountain pass. Behind them, the smoke from Silas Ridge's camp drifted into the afternoon air. The valley would look normal again by tomorrow. That is how the frontier often worked. Danger came fast, then silence followed just as quickly. But stories like this do not end in the valley. They travel. They travel in the memories of the people who lived them. Maybe that is the part worth remembering. Because when I think about this story, I do not just think about gunshots or chases through the hills. I think about the moment at the very beginning. A girl hanging upside down from a tree, terrified, certain the man walking toward her was about to do something terrible. And instead, he broke the trap with his bare hands. Sometimes the most important moments in life look like danger at first. Sometimes the person you fear the most in a moment of panic turns out to be the one person willing to stand beside you when everything else falls apart. I've always believed something simple about people. You usually do not know who someone truly is until life puts them in a hard place. Pressure reveals character. Hard days reveal the heart. Boone could have walked away that morning. No one would have blamed him. He was an older man. The mountains were quiet. The trouble was not his problem, but he stayed. And because he stayed, several lives changed forever. Maybe that is the lesson that stays with me the most. Doing the right thing rarely begins with something grand. It usually begins with a quiet choice that nobody else sees. One decision. One moment where a person decides that walking away is easier, but helping someone matters more. So here's a question I would love to ask you. If you had been in Boone's place that day, alone in the mountains, would you have stopped? Or would you have kept riding? And here's another question. How many moments like that appear in ordinary life? Not traps in the wilderness, but chances to help someone who feels alone, chances to speak kindly, chances to stand up when it would be easier to stay quiet. I think about that often, because the truth is, most of us will never face outlaws in the mountains. But we'll all face moments where our character's quietly tested, and those small moments shape the kind of life we live. Cassidy learned something important that day, too. Fear does not always mean stop. Sometimes fear simply means the road ahead matters. matters. The girl who once whispered, "Please do not do it," became the person who threw the cartridges into the fire and helped free others. Courage does not arrive fully grown. It grows step by step, decision by decision, and sometimes all it takes is one person believing you are stronger than you think. Before this story closes, I want to thank you for spending this time here. If this story stayed with you, I would appreciate a like and a subscription to the channel. That is how these old frontier stories keep riding on. And before you go, tell me in the comments what time it is where you are and where you are listening from tonight. Maybe you have coffee in hand. Maybe it is late and the house is quiet. Either way, I am glad you were here for this one. And one last thing I would like to ask you. What do you think mattered more that day? That Boone saved Cassidy, or that Cassidy found the courage to become someone Silas could no longer break? And after all that, do you think the two of them walked away from each other, or toward the same kind of peace? Either way, one thing is certain. That day in the Bitterroot Mountains began with fear, but it ended with something far more powerful. A reminder that even in the roughest corners of the world, kindness and courage still find a way to ride in.